This morning we're going to be in Exodus, looking at the life of Moses. But before you turn to Exodus, it would probably be best for you to go to Matthew chapter 17 instead. Matthew chapter 17. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different with this lesson. I am hoping to start doing a three-part series on the character of Moses, and looking at what made Moses the man that he is, and what are his qualities, and I don't know what took place in his life, and how did God use him, and what did God do to help Moses become the leader and the deliverer that we think of today. First off, though, in this lesson, I have to convince you that Moses is an interesting character and one worth looking at. In Matthew chapter 17, we get this story of Jesus. It's called the Transfiguration. And it says that Jesus, in verse 1, took Peter and James and John his brother and led him up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make you 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground and were terrified. Jesus came to them and touched them and said, "Get up and do not be afraid." And lifting up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. So in this story, Jesus is manifested as being the Son of God. That's kind of the point of this transfiguration. He's shining. His face is shining like the sun. His robes are white and blinding. And Moses and Elijah are there. Now, why Moses and Elijah? Moses and Elijah were the 2 most prominent figures in the Israelite history. They were known for being men of God. And I think maybe the only one that comes close to them would be David. But Moses and Elijah were prophets. And they were held in insanely high regard among the minds of Jews of the time. And that's why Peter says, it's good that we're here. We're going to build 3 tabernacles. One for you, one for Elijah, one for Moses. Because this is the big 3. the top of the line, most famous historical figures of Israelite history here. You have the Messiah and Moses and Elijah. And yet God says, no. This is my beloved Son. Jesus is higher, even more than Moses and Elijah, the 2 characters in Bible history that were looked up to more than anyone else. And then also, Jacob read for us Acts chapter 7 in the middle of Stephen's defense to the Jews who were surrounded and ready to kill him. Stephen mentions Moses and his life, and he gives a brief retelling of what happened with Moses and how he was called to lead the people. But before that, the Jews in chapter 6 of Acts accused Stephen of blasphemy against God and against Moses. See, Moses' name had become synonymous and just integrated with the law, because Moses was the one who taught the people God's law. He was the one who led the people and showed them God's ordinances. And so he was, again, very prominent in their minds. And you could be guilty of blaspheming the name of Moses. I think sometimes we forget that. How high of a regard the Jews had for the character of the man, Moses. And I'm not saying that we should lift Moses up on a pedestal and say that he is on the same level as Jesus. That's not true at all. But I think there is a grain of truth in the fact that Moses was a very unique individual. And he had a lot of qualities that made him very special. A good leader and a good deliverer. And I want to look at that today. And I want to talk about the first third of Moses' life. From chapter 1 to chapter 15, Exodus records the story of Moses as he is chosen by God and as he leads the people out from Egypt. This is what I see as the first third of Moses' life. We're going to look at him being a deliverer of his people. So let's start off in Exodus chapter 1 and just take a look at what were the circumstances around his birth and around his upbringing? What was growing up like for young Moses? In chapter 1, we're told that the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, they each came with their families because there was a famine, and they lived in Egypt because Joseph was able to deliver them. And they lived in the land of Goshen. And it says that they multiplied greatly. And unfortunately, in verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. And in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us, fight against us, and depart from the land." And so they inflict harsh labor upon the Israelites. They would build for them storage cities, Pithom and Ramesses, and they would force them to make bricks for the building up of their buildings. The idea was distract them with hardship, distract them with suffering so that they don't have a chance to rebel. And then Pharaoh went to the midwives. Two of them were named Shiphrah and Puah. And he tells the midwives that you're supposed to kill every man. You are supposed to kill every boy that is born to the Hebrews. However, this doesn't work. The midwives, in fearing God, they rebel against Pharaoh, and they spare the boys. And they give to Pharaoh an excuse that the women are vigorous. They give birth before we're able to get there. So God blesses those midwives. And so while the Egyptians are after the baby boys of the Hebrews and wanting to put them to death, this man, Moses, is born. In chapter 2, verse 1, a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. Behold, the boy was crying. She had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." And so the girl went, called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." So Moses' mother, we find out later that her name was Jochebed. She hid Moses in the reeds because she could no longer conceal him from the Egyptians who wanted to murder him. And yet, coincidence, Pharaoh's daughter was bathing in the river, and she found Moses and saved him. And so Moses spent the early years of his life with his mother. And I imagine he was somewhat old enough at that time to kind of grasp the idea that he was not an Egyptian, that his mother was truly his mother, and that he was a Hebrew. But he grew up in the later years of his life in the household of Pharaoh. And we're told that in Acts 7, he was about 40 years old when he went to look out over the suffering of his people. It says in verse 11 of chapter 2, "It came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And so he looked this way and that. When he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. He said to the offender, 'Why are you striking your companion?' But he said, 'Who made you a prince or judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and said, 'Surely the matter has become known.' When Moses heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." It's at this point that the Hebrews writer makes a comment about the faith of Moses. And the Hebrews writer sees something commendable about Moses' faith. Let's take a look at that in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, recording all of these great triumphs of faith of the fathers in the Israelite past. Hebrews 11, verse 23, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child. They were not afraid of the king's edict. And by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." The Hebrews writer sees this story of Moses delivering a Hebrew slave as a triumph of faith. Because in that moment, Moses did not just have an outburst of anger that one of his countrymen were being beaten, and so he just got angry and killed the Egyptian. Moses, like Stephen says in Acts 7, he supposed that they would realize, that the Hebrews would realize that God was granting them deliverance through Moses. Moses saw it as an opportunity to show the people that God is granting to them deliverance through Moses. And so Moses struck down the Egyptian. And in so doing, he made a sacrifice. He knew from that point on, from that decision on, that he would no longer be welcome in Egypt. And Hebrews commends him for that. What's interesting to me is that later on, we all kind of know the story. As the Israelites are in the wilderness, they're going to have times where they look upon their time in Egypt in a favorable light. Because the wilderness, it's not easy. It's hot and it's miserable. There's no shade. At times it feels like they're going to die. And they look back at their time at Egypt and they were like, that really wasn't that bad. And yet they were in slavery. The people of Egypt did not treat them well. And yet they looked back at Egypt and said, hey, it would be better to go to Egypt than to suffer in this wilderness. But have you ever realized that Moses was leading them? If somebody had a good reason to look back on their time in Egypt and to long for their past life that they had there, it would be Moses. He had everything in Egypt. He was raised in the royal palaces of the king of Egypt, of Pharaoh. All he had to do was continue with his life. All he had to do was be quiet and just go with the flow. And he could have had a good life. And yet Moses left that because his countrymen were suffering. And that's something to consider. You know, a lot of times we think that we have made sacrifices as Christians, that we've had to leave a lot behind in order to pursue righteousness, in order to pursue godliness. Don't think of it like you've lost something. By following Christ, you are only gaining. Consider the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of this world. Not only that, but how much are you willing to sacrifice to help deliver your neighbor, your countryman? Moses was willing to give everything. And this is really a key point in the character of Moses, by the way, and we're going to see it as we continue the story. He is a defender of the weak. He cares for those who cannot care for themselves. He sees someone in need and he takes the opportunity. He jumps in. So back in Exodus chapter 2, Pharaoh tries to kill Moses because he knows that Moses is now rebelling against him, and he's sided with the Israelites. And so he runs away. He runs to Midian, and he sits down by this well, and the daughters of the priest of Midian come with their flocks, apparently they're shepherdesses, and they're trying to water their flocks by this well, and yet there's this problem that people keep driving them away and hogging the well and only watering their own flocks. And it says that Moses delivered them from the hand of the shepherds. And it says in verse 19, even more, he drew the water for us and watered the flock. And so Moses marries Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he ends up having 2 children in this land, and he's there for about a span of 40 years, as we're told in Acts 7. He's there for 40 years, and then it says in verse 23, about in the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of their bondage. They cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel. God took notice of them. All right, now what is God going to do? That's the question. What is God going to do? Israel is crying out for help. What's the solution to this problem? Chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, and yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Notice that. Notice that God did not address him until Moses turned aside to look at the bush. I can't help but come to the conclusion that Moses could have made the choice to not look at that. Moses could have made the choice to something's on fire over there, whatever, and just tune it out of his mind and keep going. And yet Moses takes a moment and looks at the bush and approaches it. And that is when God says, Moses. And Moses is called in this section to be their ruler and their deliverer. And this time it is by God's choice. God chooses Moses. And he says, now you are going to deliver your people. However, we'll see through this section that Moses is not altogether willing. He questions God several times. He says in verse 11, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? God says, I will be with you. Moses said to God, Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel. I will say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now, what if they say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God says to Moses, I am who I am. Moses says in chapter 4, verse 1, What if they will not believe me? Or listen to what I say? They may say, The Lord has not appeared to you. God says, What's that in your hand? Moses is like, A staff. God says, Throw it on the ground. God turns it into a snake. God gives Moses ways to prove that he is sent by God. Now you wonder, his people, when he first rose up to try and deliver them, utterly rejected that attempt. It says in Acts 7 that they disowned him. They did not even see him as a fellow brother. They wanted nothing to do with him. And you think maybe that affected this call that Moses is having right now. God is trying to get him to, again, try to do what he did before. Rise up. Try to deliver your people again. And Moses, I don't know whether his confidence is shot or what. But he isn't willing to. And that's one of the flaws of Moses up to this point, is that he fails to see how God's power can work through him to accomplish God's purposes. That is the flaw that he is displaying at this moment. And then later on, Moses brings up that he's not good at talking, apparently, and so he needs Aaron to be his mouthpiece. Of course, in Acts 7, Stephen says that he was great in word and deed, so I don't think it was really true that he wasn't good at talking. But God says, take Aaron, and he's going to speak for you, and you will be God to him, and he shall be a prophet. In other words, there's going to be this play where Moses is playing the part of God, Aaron is playing the part of his prophet, in order to help Moses understand the roles of a prophet and his God. And in chapter 5, we have the first attempt. Well, before we get to chapter 5, Aaron and Moses do come to the elders of Israel, and they do the miracles that God showed Moses, and they talk to the elders, and it says in verse 31, the people believed when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel, and that he had seen their affliction, and they bowed low and worshipped. So the elders and Israel at this point, they're in a good frame of mind. And yet, that kind of changes in this next chapter. In chapter 5, Moses confronts Pharaoh for the first time and tells them that Pharaoh needs to let them go for a little while to sacrifice to God. And Pharaoh throws a tantrum. And instead of letting them go and sacrifice to God, he hardens their labor. He now forces them to gather their own wheat. And he doesn't give them enough supplies. And so the Israelites are being beaten by their taskmasters because they're not delivering on the quota. And they can't deliver on the quota. They're tired. They're frustrated. And they come to Moses. And it says in verse 21, they said to them, Pharaoh and Aaron, or Moses and Aaron, "May the Lord look upon you and judge you, for you have made us odious in Pharaoh's sight and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." They're at the breaking point here. Things are not getting better. You said they would get better, and they're not. Are you going to save us or what? The people direct their frustration of God's leadership at Moses. And this is a pattern. This happens again and again and again. The people direct their frustration from God's leadership toward Moses. And Moses in this section doesn't handle it well. In verse 22, Moses returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done harm to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." Moses is confused. Moses doesn't know what's going on. Moses questions God. He questions his character. What are you doing? God responds that he sees what's happening. In chapter 6, "You shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Under compulsion he will let them go, and under compulsion he will drive them out of his land." God promises that he will do miracles in the land of Egypt, and he is going to bring the Egyptians down low. And so he does. The 10 plagues strike the land. And the purpose of the 10 plagues were to show the glory and the power of God. In chapter 7, 1 through 6, the Lord said to Moses, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. And when Pharaoh does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt, my great judgments. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. And then in chapter 10, the Lord said to Moses in verse 1, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord." God wanted these plagues to be a teaching moment for Egypt to know that he is the Lord, and for Israel to know without a shadow of a doubt that he is God and he is able to deliver. This is a lesson that the Israelites fail to learn from the plagues, but Moses actually does learn. How do I know that? At the end of all of the plagues, Pharaoh lets the people go. So they leave Egypt, bringing with them treasures that they get from the victory that God has granted to them. They leave Egypt, and God leads them to the Red Sea. And they're standing there on the shore, And they look back behind them, and they see the army of the Egyptians, Pharaoh and his chariots in hot pursuit, and there is nowhere for them to run. Their back is toward the Red Sea, and in front of them is an army that is just going to slaughter all of them. Once again, they get confused. And they say to Moses in verse 11, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Once again, they're directing their frustration with God's leadership at Moses. But look at what Moses says to them this time. In verse 13, Moses said to the people, "Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent." The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Far as I know, God did not give Moses a rundown of his plan to divide the Red Sea and to lead the people through. Far as I know, Moses had no idea that was going to happen. On what basis did Moses have the confidence to say, "Be quiet and let God fight for you"? He learned. When Moses was in Midian, pasturing his flocks, I don't think he would have been capable of saying this to the people of Israel. And yet God used him to work the plagues that humiliated Egypt, Israel's oppressors. And Moses learned that salvation is from the Lord. He will deliver. Now, what does that mean for us? What can we learn from that? Moses learned from the plagues, and he had confidence in God's ability to save and to deliver. Are you learning from the things that God has done in your life? Are you learning from the past experiences that you've had about God's character, about his ability to save you even from the most desperate times? I think a lot of times we like to say that we do. And it's easy to say that we trust in God to deliver us when times are great. But what happens when your back is against the Red Sea and in front of you is an army? Are you able to look back and say with confidence, "See what the Lord will do in delivering you"? God gave his Son. He gave us Jesus. And Jesus died on that cross so that we could be delivered. So that we could know that we will be delivered. So don't be afraid about what's going to happen. Don't be afraid when you come across hard times. The Lord will fight for you while you keep quiet. As the story ends, we know the climactic end. God tells Moses to lift up his staff to strike the water, and the Red Sea parts, and the sons of Israel walk through on dry land. And the Egyptians come in after them to pursue them, and yet God closes the sea, and the Egyptians are destroyed. And at the end, in chapter 15, Moses and the sons of Israel, they sing a song to the Lord. And this is a famous song of deliverance, of God's power, and of how he proved on this day that he is able to deliver them. And so they sing and they dance, they rejoice in God's salvation. Yeah. But to wrap up, the first third of Moses' life, we can learn from his character in a couple ways. First off, he gave up Egypt in order to help his people. And he gave up Egypt because the reproaches of Christ were greater than the riches of Egypt. Secondly, he patiently delivers those who would disown and reject him. His own people rejected and said they wanted nothing to do with him when he first tried to help them. And yet, he tried again. And trust in God that he is able to deliver you because of what he has done for you in the past. And grow in your faith as you see what he is doing in your life. I look forward to looking through the rest of Moses' life with you guys and how he grows as a leader of his people and as a teacher, and ultimately in his relationship with God. And I hope that it'll be as much of a help to you guys as it has been to me while I've been studying through the life of Moses. But right now, we'd like to offer a chance for anybody who isn't a Christian yet. And if you want to get baptized, and if you want to follow after God and after his will, to devote your life to it, there'd be an opportunity for you now. And if there's anybody here who needs prayers, who needs help, we have a chance for you to ask for that if you'd come forward while we stand and sing.